Forever humans looked up and dreamed of flying, right? Seeing birds, just wishing we could do that.
Mm-hmm. Pure fantasy for generations.
And then, somehow, we cracked it. Heavier than air flight became real.
Mm.
Today on this deep dive, we're going straight back to the beginning, the absolute origin story of the aircraft.
Exactly. And while, the whole history of aviation involves things like air traffic control later on, today we're zooming right in.
Okay.
We're focusing on that crucial first decade or so, right after the Wright brothers' big moment in 1903.
Got it.
The mission here is to really understand that initial spark. Who were the key people? How did the design start? And crucially, how did they start trying to actually use these things?
Right. So December 17th, 1903, Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers. That image is burned into history, isn't it?
Absolutely iconic. The start of sustained, powered flight, no question.
But here's the interesting bit. Despite everyone being amazed, it wasn't like planes suddenly filled the skies the next year. Practical use took a while to catch on.
That's a really key point. Those first few years were, well, more about tinkering, testing, pushing the limits a bit further. The big question was still hanging there. Okay, it flies, but what's it for? Beyond the novelty, what practical job could it do?
Which kind of leads us to Thomas Benoist, right? In 1914, he tried to answer that question.
He did. A really early, bold attempt, the world's first scheduled air service.
Get this. An 18-mile route using a seaplane across Tampa Bay in Florida. That sounds incredibly modern for 1914.
It was visionary. Connecting St. Petersburg and Tampa, he had these Benoist 4th seaplanes aimed mostly at tourists, actually.
Ah, tourists.
Yeah, it showed real belief in air travel for, just getting from A to B.
No, it didn't quite take off, commercially speaking.
No, sadly, it only lasted a few months. Part of it was the tourist season ending, so demand dropped off naturally.
Okay.
And you also had, trains. The railroads were established. Reliable competition.
Right. Tough market to break into.
Very tough. Benoist's venture, though short, it really highlights something important. Technology alone isn't enough. You need the business side, the infrastructure. It's a lesson we see again and again, isn't it? Integrating it into how things already work.
Totally. And as soon as you had even a few of these machines buzzing around, another thought must have occurred, like with the first cars on the road.
Exactly. Suddenly you realize, hang on, if there's more than one of these up there.
How do we stop them bumping into each other? Safety. Organization, control.
Precisely. The initial focus was all mechanics just getting airborne, but then came the dawning realization about needing some kind of coordination, the seeds of air traffic control way back then, and that growing awareness about safety and order really sets us up for the next big player jumping in, the U.S. Navy.
Okay, this is fascinating because the Navy got involved surprisingly early, didn't they? When maybe others were still thinking of planes as just curiosities.
They really did. Very proactive. We're talking 1911, just 8 years after Kitty Hawk. And they weren't just watching, they were actively experimenting.
What kind of things?
Well, think about operating from ships. They saw the potential for reconnaissance, maybe other uses. So 1911 was busy. You had Eugene Ely landing on a ship's deck, stopped by sandbags. Imagine rigging that up. That was the very first sort of arresting gear.
Wow. Crude but effective, I guess.
Totally. And then actually lifting a plane onto the deck of the USS Pennsylvania, these were huge steps in figuring out naval aviation.
And they weren't just sticking to daytime, were they? I read about Lieutenant Ellison's first night flight.
Theodore G. Ellison, yeah. First night flight by a naval aviator. Think about that, flying one of those early fragile planes in the dark.
Terrifying.
And then landing on water on his second try without lights. That takes serious guts. Real pioneering spirit.
Incredible. And they formalized it too, setting up a base.
Yep. Captain Washington the Chambers established the first naval aviation base. An experimental station at Greenberry Point, Annapolis. That's a real commitment.
And Glenn Curtiss was involved too.
Oh, hugely. Glenn H. Curtiss. He demonstrated the Navy's first plane, the Triad, showed it could be amphibious.
Right. Take off from land, wheels up in the air, land on water. Like inventing a whole new type of vehicle.
Pretty much. Seaplanes were super important early on, of course. No need for prepared runways.
Makes sense.
So the Triad was a big deal. And the Navy's second plane, the A-2, was flown by both Curtiss and Lieutenant Ellison. Shows that close link between civilian innovators and the military.
It sounds like a real hive of activity. You mentioned officers being sent to the Naval Academy for tests and training.
They knew they needed expertise fast. Not just pilots, but people who understood the engineering, the mechanics. So they set up instruction and development work building that knowledge base.
And they looked outwards, too,
Yeah.
sending people abroad.
Yeah, August 1911. First time naval aviators acted as observers overseas. Lieutenant Commander Mustin, Lieutenant Bellinger, First Lieutenant Smith, off to Paris.
Paris. Why Paris?
Well, France was a major center for aviation back then. Lots of factories, aerodromes. They went to see what the Europeans were up to, learn from them.
SARD, gather intelligence, basically.
Exactly. And they started assigning aviation assistants to naval attaches. Lieutenant Towers in London was the first, formalizing that information gathering.
Okay, fast forward a bit. 1915, NASIA gets created. National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. That sounds official. Important.
It was a huge step. NASIA basically said, okay, this flying thing is serious science now.
Nah.
It wasn't just about tinkering inventors anymore. It needed organized scientific research, a model that's driven tech ever since, really.
And the Navy was involved from the start?
Yep, Captain Bristol, Lieutenant Richardson were Navy members on NASIA. It came about through a rider on the Naval Appropriations Act, actually. Shows that ongoing Navy connection.
Then the 1916 Naval Appropriations Act seems like another big one. Deals with personnel, pay, even. Risk.
That's a really significant act. It recognized flying was different, dangerous, so increased pay and allowances for flying duty, and not just for officers, but enlisted men, students too.
Yeah.
And it increased the amount for qualified aviators. Plus, and this is pretty sobering, it provided a year's pay to the families of those killed in accidents.
Wow. Acknowledging the danger right there in the legislation.
Absolutely. It tells you a lot about the risks they were taking.
That act also set limits on personnel numbers, right? Seems quite small looking back.
It does. An annual average of 48 Navy officers, 96 enlisted men, 12 Marine officers, 24 enlisted men. Gives you a scale. It was still a specialized, relatively small field.
And they changed the job title too?
They did. March 1916, Navy air pilot became naval aviator. Maybe subtle, but suggests a growing professional identity.
Then later in 1916, the Navy broadens the term aeronautics.
Right, a general order in June. It wasn't just naval airplanes anymore. It included lighter-than-aircraft dirigibles, balloons.
Okay, covering all bases.
And, crucially, it made the Bureau of Construction and Repair the lead agency for developing and buying aircraft, streamlining the whole process, putting someone in charge.
Made sense.
Yeah.
And training stayed central. Pensacola.
Absolutely. August 1916, they reorganized the Naval Aeronautics Station down in Pensacola, Florida. Its main job became training people for the fleet's air services.
Setting up proper departments.
Exactly. Manufacturing, experimental test and inspection, an aeronautics school, a major investment in building skilled personnel.
And the funding kept coming.
Yes. The next Appropriation Act for fiscal year 1917 funded a naval flying corps, 150 officers, 350 enlisted men, plus a naval reserve flying corps. They were clearly planning to scale up.
It's amazing how quickly things are moving. They were even thinking about integrating other tech, like radio.
Yeah, October 1916, the Bureau of Steam Engineering asked the Philadelphia Navy Yard to develop a lightweight radio direction finder for planes.
Lightweight being the key word there, I imagine.
Definitely. But thinking about radio for navigation that early, that's real foresight.
But all this progress, it came at a cost, didn't it? You mentioned the risks earlier.
Tragically, yes. November 1916, an experimental bomb test flight went wrong. 2 naval aviators were killed.
Oh, no.
It's a stark reminder. Pushing the envelope in early aviation was incredibly dangerous work. These pioneers really did risk everything.
So pulling it all together,
Yeah.
after the Wrights' breakthrough, it wasn't an overnight revolution.
No, it was gradual, determined.
We saw Benoist's early, maybe slightly premature commercial dream, and then the Navy stepping up in a big way, figuring out ship operations, setting up training, organizing research, really laying down the foundations.
Exactly right. All those early designs, the endless experiments, the structures the Navy put in place, it was all absolutely critical groundwork. Often overlooked, maybe,
Yeah.
but it was that intense period of learning, trial, and error that paved the way for the huge leaps that came next, especially once World War I kicked off and suddenly aviation became strategically vital.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the sheer scale of the challenge back then. Not just flying, but figuring out why fly, how to do it safely, how to organize it all. It sounds like the birth story of so many big technologies.
It does echo, doesn't it?
So here's something to ponder. What are those fundamental things, those principles that seem to pop up again and again during these big moments of innovation? What stays consistent?
That's a great question. Maybe it's always that mix. Individual brilliance, sure, but also that solid institutional backing, like the Navy provided, a willingness to experiment, fail, learn.
And having a clear idea eventually of what the technology could actually do.
Right. Maybe that combination is the secret sauce, whatever the era, whatever the tech.
Definitely food for thought. Well, that wraps up our deep dive into the dawn of the aircraft, how it all began. Thanks so much for guiding us through those foundational years.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating period to revisit.
And a huge thank you to you for joining us on this deep dive. If you enjoyed exploring this early aviation history, please do hit like or share. It genuinely helps us reach more people.
We appreciate the support.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.